You'd be nothing without me. Evelyn is the controlling shareholder. You were gonna sell my company. We've been negotiating with the wrong Hayes. I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine.
I still remember the smug, pitying look on my husband's face when he told me I was dead weight. You'd be nothing without me, he sneered, adjusting his designer tie. He was so incredibly confident. But 20 minutes later, the lead attorney cleared his throat, and my husband's entire empire legally became mine. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low, murmuring hum of wealth always made my skin crawl. But for Richard, it was oxygen. We were standing in the sprawling, meticulously manicured gardens of the Wellington estate, surrounded by the elite of Chicago's real estate development scene. Richard was holding court, as he always did, his booming laugh echoing off the stone facade of the mansion. And so I told the zoning board, Richard projected, making sure Harrison Tate and the other investors were hanging on to his every word. If they wanted the skyline revitalized, they had to let me rewrite the blueprint. It was a massive risk, of course. But vision always requires a little danger. Harrison chuckled, swirling his bourbon. Brilliant play, Richard. Truly, Oak and Iron Developments is practically carrying the West Loop's revival on its back. You must be exhausted. A captain never sleeps, Richard replied, flashing his signature blinding smile. I stood 2 feet behind his left shoulder, the exact position he preferred. Close enough to look like the supportive, dutiful wife, but far enough back not to cast a shadow on his spotlight. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my face perfectly neutral. The brilliant play with the zoning board hadn't been Richard's. It had been mine. I had spent 3 sleepless weeks poring over 90-year-old municipal codes, finding a forgotten loophole regarding historical facade preservation that allowed us to bypass the height restrictions. I had drafted the proposal. I had bound the pitch deck. Richard had simply carried the briefcase into the room and read my words off a teleprompter. But according to Richard's version of history, I was merely the woman who picked up his dry cleaning. Evelyn, Madeline Tate, Harrison's wife, suddenly turned to me, her eyes dripping with condescending sympathy. It must be so hard for you, having a husband who works such brutal hours. How do you fill your days? Shopping? Charity boards? Before I could open my mouth to explain that I was the CFO of the company they were currently worshipping, Richard's heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. It looked like an affectionate squeeze to the outside world, but his fingers dug sharply into my collarbone. Evelyn keeps the home fires burning, Richard said smoothly, his tone dripping with patronizing affection. She makes sure I have a quiet place to land. Not everyone is built for the pressure cooker of business, Madeline. Evie has a gentle soul. She'd crumble if she had to deal with the sharks. My stomach tightened. I forced a polite, tight-lipped smile, stepping out from under his grip. "Excuse me," I murmured. "I need to check on the valet." As I walked away, I heard Richard lower his voice, playing the long-suffering genius. "She tries. Bless her. But you know how it is. Without me, she'd be lost. Completely lost." That was the narrative Richard had spent the last 7 years meticulously crafting. When we first met, we were both 24 and broke. I was a junior accountant with a fierce ambition and a small inheritance from my late grandfather. Richard was a charismatic, failing real estate agent who couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life. We had built Oak and Iron together at our cramped kitchen table. My grandfather's money was the seed capital. My financial strategies kept us afloat during the lean years. But as the company grew, Richard's ego swelled to consume all the air in the room. He slowly, systematically pushed me out of the public-facing roles. He changed the passwords to the primary operating accounts. He moved our corporate offices to a sleek downtown high-rise and assigned me a home office so I could relax. The gaslighting was so gradual, so expertly executed, that for a long time I actually believed him when he said he was doing it to protect me. But the garden party at the Wellingtons was the tipping point. The sheer audacity of his lie, told so easily, snapped something deep inside my chest. I didn't go to the valet. I went to the guest bathroom, locked the door, and stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror. The woman looking back at me was 31, wearing a $5,000 dress she didn't choose, living a life she didn't control, married to a man who saw her as a prop. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person I trusted. "Sarah," I whispered when my best friend picked up. "I need you to come over tomorrow while Richard is at the golf course. Bring your portable scanner. I need to look at the books." The next day, the house was eerily silent. Richard had left for a weekend golf retreat in Pebble Beach with Harrison and the boys, leaving his mahogany-paneled home office locked. He always locked it. He claimed it contained sensitive client data, but I knew better. It was the physical manifestation of his control over our lives. What Richard didn't know was that 3 years ago, when the lock was installed, I had quietly paid the locksmith an extra $100 to cut a duplicate key, which I kept taped beneath the floorboard under my vanity. When Sarah arrived, she dumped her oversized tote bag on the kitchen island and pulled out a high-speed document scanner. "Are you sure about this, Evie?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "If Richard catches us—" "He's in California," I said, my voice steadier than my hands. "And even if he wasn't, I'm done being terrified in my own home. Let's go." I retrieved the key, and we slipped into his study. The air felt heavy, smelling faintly of his expensive cologne and aged paper. I booted up his desktop. I had memorized his password months ago by watching the reflection in the window behind his desk while Sarah started opening filing cabinets. For the first 2 hours, we found nothing but routine contracts, inflated expense reports. Richard was apparently charging thousands of dollars in business dinners at five-star resorts to the company, and endless marketing materials featuring Richard's face. But then, Sarah pulled out a heavy, red leather folder from the bottom drawer of a locked safe we had managed to pry open, using the master code I guessed from his mother's birthday. "Evelyn," Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave, "you need to see this." I walked over and took the stack of papers from her hands. My blood ran ice cold as I read the header. Confidential Acquisition Agreement, Apex Holdings LLC, and Oak and Iron Developments. Richard was selling the company, our company. I flipped frantically through the pages. The numbers were staggering. Apex was offering $50 million for a complete buyout. But the horror wasn't the sale itself. It was the structure of the payout. Richard had set up a dummy offshore account in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation. According to the contract, 95% of the liquid assets from the buyout were to be wired directly into that offshore account upon signing. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I flipped to the back. There was a draft of a divorce petition clipped to the final page. He was going to sell the company, hide the money offshore, and blindside me with divorce papers, leaving me with nothing but the prenup we signed when we were 24, and penniless, a prenup that stated I would only receive a small lump sum, and the house. "He's liquidating everything," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He's taking it all, Sarah." "That absolute bastard," Sarah hissed, her eyes blazing. "We need to call a lawyer. Right now. We need to freeze the assets." "No," I said, a strange, terrifying calm washing over me. The panic was receding, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. "If we freeze the assets, he'll know I know. He'll lawyer up, drag this out for years, and hide the money better. He thinks I'm stupid. He thinks I don't pay attention." I stared down at the documents, my mind racing back to the very beginning, to the cramped kitchen table, to my grandfather's trust. "Take pictures of everything," I ordered Sarah, moving back to the computer. "Scan it all. I need to make a phone call." I dialed a number I hadn't called in 7 years. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "David Cole's office." "David," I said, gripping the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. "It's Evelyn. Evelyn Hayes. Before I was married, I was Evelyn Montgomery." There was a pause on the line. David Cole was my late grandfather's estate lawyer. He was sharp, ruthless, and possessed a memory like a steel trap. "Little Evie," he said softly, "it's been a long time. Your grandfather's trust has been sitting quietly. What can I do for you?" "I need you to pull the original formation documents for Oak and Iron Developments," I said. "The ones we filed in Delaware before Richard moved the headquarters to Illinois. I need you to confirm something for me." I waited on the line for 10 agonizing minutes, listening to the sound of typing and rustling paper on his end. Finally, David came back on the line. "Just as we set it up, Evelyn," David said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "Your grandfather insisted." The seed money came from the Montgomery Family Trust, and the LLC was structured so that the trust, of which you are the sole trustee and beneficiary, maintains 51% controlling interest in any and all intellectual property, physical assets, and subsidiary offshoots of Oak and Iron. Richard was listed as a minority operating partner at 49%. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. Richard always assumed because he was the CEO and the public face, he owned it all. He never read the Delaware filings, did he? Richard Hayes, David chuckled darkly, is a man who signs where the sticky flags tell him to sign and relies on his charm to cover his ignorance. If he's attempting to sell the company without your explicit notarized signature as the majority shareholder, the transaction is entirely fraudulent. He has a signing ceremony scheduled for next Friday with Apex Holdings, I said, looking at the schedule in the red folder. He told me we have a mandatory board meeting at his lawyer's office to sign some routine tax declarations. Is that so? David murmured. Well, it sounds like you and I need to have a sit-down before Friday, Evelyn. Bring every document you have. When Richard returned from his golf trip on Sunday night, he was perfectly tanned and buzzing with nervous, manic energy. He poured himself a scotch and lounged on the leather sofa, watching me as I quietly folded laundry. Big week ahead, Evie, he said, swirling the amber liquid. Lots of corporate restructuring. I need you down at the firm's legal office on Friday at noon. Just some spousal consent forms for the new tax bracket. It'll take 5 minutes. Of course, Richard, I said softly, keeping my eyes downcast. Whatever you need. He scoffed, taking a sip of his drink. Good girl. You know, Harrison was asking about you this weekend. I told him you were happy in your little domestic bubble. You really have no idea how brutal it is out there in the real world, Evie. You'd be nothing without me, eaten alive in a day. I folded one of his expensive golf shirts, smoothing out the collar with deliberate precision. I'm sure you're right, Richard, I replied, hiding a smile. I don't know what I'd do without you. Friday arrived with a thunderstorm that rattled the windows of our penthouse. The sky was the color of bruised iron, perfectly matching the tension inside the black town car as Richard and I rode in silence toward the financial district. Richard was practically vibrating with excitement. He wore a brand new Tom Ford suit and couldn't stop checking his Rolex. To him, today was the day he secured $50 million, rid himself of a wife he viewed as an anchor, and sailed off into the sunset. To me, today was an execution, and I was the one holding the axe. Now listen to me carefully, Richard snapped as the car pulled up to the glass and steel skyscraper housing his legal team. Sterling and Vance, wait, no, Miller and Associates. He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee and mints. When we get up there, you sit quietly. Don't ask stupid questions. The men from Apex are serious people. I don't want you confusing them or embarrassing me. When the lawyer points, you sign. Do you understand? I understand perfectly, Richard, I said smoothly, stepping out of the car before he could open the door for me. We rode the elevator to the 45th floor. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble and frosted glass. Richard strutted through the double doors like a conquering king, throwing his coat at the receptionist without looking at her. I followed quietly behind, clutching a sleek, black leather portfolio against my chest. We were led into the primary boardroom. It was a massive, intimidating space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked city. Seated on one side of the vast mahogany table were 3 men in dark suits, the executives from Apex Holdings, led by Jonathan Reese, a notorious corporate raider with cold, calculating eyes. On the other side sat Richard's corporate attorney, a nervous-looking man named Gregory. "Gentlemen," Richard boomed, throwing his arms wide. "Jonathan, so glad we could finalize this today." "Richard," Jonathan Reese said tightly, not standing up. His gaze drifted over to me. "And who is this?" We agreed this was a closed-door finalization. "Ah, this is my wife, Evelyn," Richard said, waving a hand dismissively in my direction. "Don't mind her. She's just here to sign the spousal waivers for the capital gains transfer. Evie, sit in the corner." I didn't move toward the corner chairs. Instead, I walked directly to the head of the table, directly opposite Jonathan Reese, and pulled out the large leather chair. I sat down, placing my black portfolio squarely on the polished mahogany in front of me. Richard's face flashed with irritation. "Evelyn," I said the corner. "I think I'll sit here, Richard," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. Before Richard could march over and grab my arm, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open again. In walked David Cole. Despite being in his late 60s, David moved with the lethal grace of a shark. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, carrying a battered leather briefcase that looked older than I was. Richard frowned, turning to his own attorney. Gregory, who the hell is this? I thought you said the floor was secure. Gregory looked utterly bewildered. I I don't know who this man is, Richard. David Cole walked calmly to the head of the table and stood directly behind my chair. He placed his briefcase on the table and clicked the brass locks open. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence. Good afternoon, gentlemen, David said, his voice a rich, authoritative baritone. My name is David Cole. I am the senior partner at Cole, Harding, and Finch, and I represent the majority shareholder and controlling interest of Oak and Iron Developments. Jonathan Reese narrowed his eyes, looking from David to Richard. What is this, Hayes? I thought you were the sole proprietor. Is this a shakedown? I am the sole proprietor, Richard barked, his face flushing dark red. He turned furiously to David. I don't know who you are, old man, but you have 30 seconds to get out of my boardroom before I have security throw you through the glass. David ignored him completely. He pulled a thick stack of watermarked documents from his briefcase and slid them across the table toward Jonathan Reese. Mr. Reese, David said smoothly, I assume you and your legal team have done your due diligence regarding this $50 million acquisition? Of course we have, Jonathan sneered. We've reviewed Mr. Hayes's operating agreements, the corporate tax returns, the Illinois state filings. Ah, David interrupted, raising a single finger. The Illinois state filings. A common, yet fatal, oversight. You see, Oak and Iron Developments was not originally incorporated in Illinois. It was formed 7 years ago in the state of Delaware. Richard let out a harsh, derisive laugh. What are you talking about? I moved the LLC to Illinois 5 years ago. I signed the paperwork myself. Evelyn, tell this lunatic to get out. He's ruining the deal. I didn't look at Richard. I kept my eyes locked on Jonathan Reese, who was now slowly opening the folder David had provided. You registered a subsidiary in Illinois, Mr. Hayes, David corrected, his tone turning razor sharp. But the parent company, the holding entity that owns every patent, every architectural copyright, and every physical asset you possess, remains in Delaware. And if Mr. Reese's legal team had dug just one layer deeper, they would have found the original articles of incorporation. The boardroom was dead silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. Jonathan Reese's face drained of color as he read the highlighted paragraphs in the document before him. What does it say, Jonathan? Richard demanded, a slight tremor of uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. What is he talking about? Jonathan Reese looked up, his eyes wide and furious. He threw the document across the table toward Richard. It says, You arrogant fool, Jonathan hissed, that you don't own this company. Richard snatched the paper. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, his lips moving silently as he read the complex legal jargon. He reached the bottom of the page, where a series of signatures rested above heavily embossed seals. This is fake, Richard stammered, dropping the paper as if it burned him. This says the Montgomery Family Trust owns 51% of Oak and Iron. I've never even heard of the Montgomery Family Trust. That, I said, speaking up for the first time since sitting down, is because you never listened to me, Richard. Everyone's eyes snapped to me. I leaned forward, folding my hands over my black portfolio. My maiden name was Montgomery. My grandfather's trust provided the seed money that kept us from going bankrupt in our first year. I drafted the formation documents. I asked you to read them before you signed them on our kitchen table. Do you remember what you told me? Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. You told me, I continued, my voice ice-cold and unwavering. Just point to where I need to sign, Evie. Reading fine print gives me a headache. So, you signed as a minority operating partner. I retained the majority. For 7 years, I have allowed you to play CEO, because I thought we were building a life together. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out the red folder Sarah and I had copied from his safe. I tossed it onto the center of the table. But then I found out about your little offshore account in the Caymans, I said, staring directly into Richard's terrified eyes. And the draft of the divorce papers. You were going to sell my company, steal my money, and leave me with nothing. Evie, Richard whispered, his confident veneer completely shattering. He looked small, pathetic. Evie, you're misunderstanding. The lawyer is about to read exactly what is going to happen next, Richard, I said, leaning back in my chair. And for once in your life, I suggest you close your mouth and listen. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For 7 years, I had watched Richard command rooms just like this one, with effortless arrogance. I had watched him spin lies into gold, using my intellect as his personal currency. But in that moment, stripped of his carefully constructed illusions, he looked completely ordinary. David Cole cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened a fresh manila folder. As the majority shareholder, David began, his voice echoing with devastating authority, my client, Evelyn Hayes, acting as the sole trustee of the Montgomery Family Trust, has the unilateral right to veto any sale, merger, or acquisition involving Oak and Iron Developments or any of its subsidiaries. Furthermore, upon review of the proposed acquisition terms with Apex Holdings, it has come to my client's attention that Mr. Hayes engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation. He willfully concealed the corporate structure and attempted to divert 95% of the acquisition funds into a Cayman Islands account under the shell entity Blue Horizon Ventures. Jonathan Reese turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Richard like a sniper finding his mark. You tried to use my company to launder a fraudulent buyout? Jonathan, listen to me, Richard pleaded, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. She's hysterical. She doesn't understand the complexities of corporate tax shielding. This is a domestic dispute, that's all. Gregory, talk to them. Richard's attorney, Gregory, aggressively shoved his chair back from the table, wanting as much physical distance from Richard as possible. I have never seen these Delaware formation documents in my life, Gregory stammered, his face pale. My firm was hired strictly to handle the Illinois subsidiary and the Apex transaction based on the disclosures Mr. Hayes provided under penalty of perjury. If he lied about the ownership structure, I am formally withdrawing my counsel as of this exact moment. Gregory slammed his notebook shut, shoved it into his briefcase, and practically sprinted for the mahogany double doors. Gregory! Get back here! Richard shouted, his voice cracking, but the door clicked shut, leaving Richard entirely alone on his side of the table. I looked at Jonathan Reese. Despite the chaotic collapse of the deal he had spent months negotiating, the corporate raider looked surprisingly calm. He leaned back, steepling his fingers, and looked at me with a newfound respect. Mrs. Hayes, Jonathan said. His tone entirely shifted from dismissive to businesslike. It appears I owe you an apology for assuming you were merely a spectator. However, this leaves Apex Holdings in a very difficult position. We have allocated $50 million of liquid capital for this acquisition. We want the West Loop portfolio. What is your play here? Are you killing the deal to spite your husband? I am not a vindictive woman, Mr. Reese. I am a businesswoman, I replied, opening my black leather portfolio. I am killing this deal because the valuation is insultingly low, and the terms were structured by a man who couldn't pass a basic accounting exam. Richard let out a strangled noise of outrage, but Jonathan held up a hand, silencing him instantly. Go on, Jonathan said. I slid a newly bound prospectus across the table. Oak and Iron's West Loop portfolio is currently generating a steady 22% year-over-year growth. But Richard was eager for a quick, dirty cash out because he wanted to fund his personal exit strategy. I, however, am interested in long-term legacy. I am willing to sell Apex a 30% non-controlling stake in the subsidiary managing the West Loop project for $40 million. You get your foothold in the Chicago market, and I retain operational control and the lion's share of the profits. Jonathan's eyebrows shot up. He opened the prospectus, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed financial projections I had spent the last 72 hours drafting with Sarah in my kitchen. This is aggressive, Jonathan murmured, a predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. But the math is flawless. Who drafted these projections? I did, I said. Just like I found the zoning loophole that made the West Loop project viable in the first place. You've been negotiating with the wrong Hayes this entire time, Jonathan. You arrogant bitch, Richard hissed, slamming his fist onto the table. The sudden violence of the action made everyone flinch, but I held my ground, staring coldly into his eyes. You think you can just waltz in here and take my company? I built oak and iron. I'm the face. I shake the hands. Without me, the investors will pull out by Monday morning. Let them, I said evenly. Because the alternative for you, Richard, is prison. David Cole stepped forward, laying a final stack of papers squarely in front of Richard. In addition to halting the Apex buyout, David stated, "We are hereby serving you with a formal notice of immediate termination from your role as Chief Executive Officer of Oak and Iron Developments, pending a full forensic audit. Pursuant to the bylaws you failed to read, the majority shareholder holds the right to remove any minority operating partner for breach of fiduciary duty." Breach of fiduciary duty? Richard scoffed, though his voice shook. You have nothing. We have copies of your expense accounts, I corrected him, including the $75,000 of corporate funds you diverted over the last 2 years to pay for consulting fees to a woman named Chloe Sterling who, according to my research, is a 24-year-old fitness instructor in Malibu, not a real estate consultant. We also have the routing numbers for the Cayman Islands account you failed to disclose to the IRS. Richard looked as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. You have 2 choices, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. Option 1. I hand this entire red folder over to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I let you spend the next 10 years fighting federal wire fraud and tax evasion charges in court. I guarantee they will freeze whatever pitiful assets you have left. I paused, letting the reality of a federal indictment wash over him. Option 2, I continued. You sign the termination agreement David has prepared. You surrender your 49% minority stake back to the company for a buyout of $1. You walk out of this building, you pack a single suitcase from the penthouse, and you sign the divorce papers on my terms. If you do that, I will bury the Cayman Islands documents, and you get to stay out of a federal penitentiary. Richard looked frantically around the room, searching for an ally, but there was no one. Gregory was gone. Jonathan Reese was studying my prospectus, clearly entirely uninterested in the demise of a fraud. David Cole stood like a stone sentinel. You're bluffing, Richard whispered, though a tear of sheer terror leaked from the corner of his eye. You wouldn't destroy me, Evie. You love me. I loved the man I thought you were when we were 24, I said, feeling a strange sense of closure wash over my chest. But you were right, Richard. I'd be nothing without you. I would just be a brilliant, wealthy, independent woman, and I think I'm ready to embrace that nothingness. I slid a silver Mont Blanc pen across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop right against his knuckles. Sign the papers, Richard, or I call the SEC right now. With a trembling hand, Richard picked up the pen. He didn't bother reading the fine print this time either. He simply flipped to the signature pages, the scratch of the nib against the heavy paper, echoing like the final nails being driven into the coffin of our marriage. The aftermath of an explosion is always quieter than you expect. When I returned to the penthouse that evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the Chicago skyline glittering like crushed diamonds against the velvet night. Richard was already gone. True to my word, I had given him exactly 2 hours to pack his personal clothing and golf clubs. He had left his keys on the marble kitchen island, alongside a half-empty glass of scotch. I picked up the glass, poured the expensive liquor down the drain, and dropped his keys into the trash can. The following Monday, I officially took over the corner office at Oak and Iron Developments. The transition was anything but smooth. As Richard had predicted, the immediate reaction from our investors was panic. The Old Boys Club of Chicago real estate was entirely comfortable doing business with a charismatic, backslapping extrovert like Richard. They were significantly less thrilled to discover that a 31-year-old woman they had previously dismissed as a dutiful housewife was suddenly calling the shots. By Tuesday afternoon, Harrison Tate barged into my office without knocking, his face flushed with indignation. "Evelyn, what the hell is going on here?" Harrison demanded, planting his hands on my desk. Richard called me in a panic, saying you ambushed him with some archaic legal loophole and forced him out of his own company. I'm telling you right now, my firm isn't funding the River North expansion if Richard isn't at the helm. I didn't flinch. I calmly finished typing an email, hit send, and then looked up at Harrison. "Have a seat, Harrison," I said. gesturing to the chair opposite me. I don't want to sit, he snapped. I want answers. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. I tossed it onto the desk between us. Richard didn't leave because of an archaic loophole, Harrison. He left because I caught him attempting to embezzle $50 million through an offshore shell company. He also used our corporate accounts as his personal piggy bank to fund his extramarital affairs. Harrison stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. You're welcome to look at the financial proofs in that folder, I continued, my voice calm and steady. But before you threaten to pull your funding, you should know that I closed a deal with Jonathan Reese at Apex Holdings yesterday morning. They are injecting $40 million into our operating budget for a minority stake. We don't actually need your firm's money for the River North expansion anymore. Harrison's jaw dropped. Apex? You got Jonathan Reese to sign on as a minority partner? I did, I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. Because Jonathan Reese recognizes competence. The truth, Harrison, is that Richard was a mascot. I found the properties. I structured the debt. I navigated the zoning boards. I built the machine. Richard just stood in front of it and took the applause. You can keep your money in oak and iron and watch your returns double over the next 5 years, or you can pull out today. But make your decision based on business, not because you miss your golf buddy. Harrison slowly sank into the chair, his bluster completely deflated. He opened the envelope, scanning the undeniable proof of Richard's financial incompetence. By the time he looked back up at me, the condescending sympathy he and his wife had shown me at the garden party was entirely gone. It was replaced by something much better: respect. Well, Harrison muttered, clearing his throat. It seems I owe you an apology, Evelyn. The River North funding stays. Over the next 6 months, I systematically scrubbed Richard's presence from the company. We rebranded, moving away from the flashy, aggressive marketing campaigns he loved, focusing instead on sustainable architecture and community-focused development. The investors who stayed saw their portfolios flourish. The ones who left to follow Richard quickly learned that charm doesn't secure building permits or balance budgets. The last time I saw Richard was at the final divorce mediation. He looked entirely different. The bespoke Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by a slightly rumpled off-the-rack jacket. The blinding confidence that used to radiate from him had completely evaporated. He was working at a mid-level commercial brokerage in the suburbs, forced to actually cold call clients and work for his commissions. He sat across from me in the drab conference room, refusing to meet my eyes as he signed the final dissolution papers. Because of the evidence of his infidelity and financial fraud, the prenup we had signed years ago held up perfectly. He got exactly what the document dictated: a modest lump sum of $50,000, and the car he drove. The penthouse, the company, and the legacy remained entirely mine. As we stood up to leave, Richard finally looked at me. There was a profound bitterness in his gaze, mixed with a desperate, lingering need to have the last word. You ruined me, Evie, he said, his voice bitter and hollow. I hope you're happy sitting alone in that big office. You took everything I built. I stopped at the door, turning back to look at the man who had spent 7 years trying to shrink me down to a size that made him feel large. I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine, Richard, I said softly, feeling the weight of the last 7 years finally lift from my shoulders. And for the record, I'm not alone in that office. I'm exactly where I belong. I walked out of the building and stepped into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. The city stretched out before me, a labyrinth of steel, glass, and endless possibilities. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs with a brilliant, intoxicating freedom. Richard was right about one thing. Vision always requires a little danger. But he forgot that I was the one who drew the blueprints. Thank you for listening to my story. If my journey from a silenced wife to a powerhouse CEO inspired you, please hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own worth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more real-life stories of dramatic revenge and personal triumph. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to stand up to a narcissist?